Alright, time for the final video of the week. So let's examine conservatism, and I'll make a proposal similar to what I do with the ANCAPs and the socialists. So first off, what defines a conservative? Now, of course, this depends on where you are. See, unlike most groups, conservatism is defined more by what it isn't than what it is. It is conservation, so they're not pushing for anything, they're just trying to keep things a certain way, or keep certain values. This means it's varied. For example, Western conservatives are generally liberals in some way, shape, or form, just not liberals in the American sense. Like they follow the doctrine of liberalism, but they aren't pushing for more reforms like modern liberals. In the Middle East, generally you'll see more Islamic fundamentalism and traditionalism. And, of course, in East Asia, you'll see tradition based on Confucian and Buddhist values. It really depends on where exactly you are and what the beliefs are for that people at that time. So, given the variation, they're also far more local based. They aren't tied to some global reach and belief system. After all, do you think a dude out in the Midwest who just cares about his small town values, Christianity, and a few other things, is really going to care what's going on in, I don't know, Japan? Some random place in Russia? No, they aren't. They're far more tied to local areas and local belief systems. Largest they'll usually get to is country. That's about it. And finally, it should be noted, they are reactionary in certain situations. And I don't use this as an insult, it's just a reality. Let's say it's 2000, and the Overton window is here. This is what's considered moderate, right? So if this is moderate in the 2000s, and someone grows up during that time, and they happen to be here, if, say, things shift over here, and this is a moderate in the 2010s, extreme shift, but still it gets the point across, this person functionally becomes a reactionary. Because what they wanted to conserve is now gone. It doesn't necessarily have to be a good old days of the 1920s or anything like that. It just has to be, hey, we had these things that I believed were right, and they pushed beyond that. I want to go back so we don't have to do that again. Naturally, of course, if this happens too quickly, the reactionary backlash can be quite immense. So, even for the liberals, it's worth acknowledging, pushing too quickly is generally a bad idea because the amount of people who experience this grows exponentially the more you do it. So when you're looking at conservatism, it's always important to factor that in because it is entirely relative of what is going on in that society at that time. I guarantee you, a conservative in the 1800s is not the same as a conservative in the 2000s. This is different from anarchists or socialists because they have fundamental beliefs that tie them all together. After all, an anarcho-capitalist firmly believes in their policies and how the society should be. The exact way they achieve it is different because, well, society is different, technology, so on and so forth. Socialists, same thing. They still want the same ends. But a conservative is different. They are not tied together by some policies, but by values they wish to conserve and will choose anything to achieve those. For example, in a country without an electoral college, they won't support such a thing because that's not what they consider right. But as you see in the United States, a lot of conservatives support the electoral college because, well, That's tradition. That's what the founders gave them. They consider that right. And so, when you're thinking of conservatism and planning around them, you have to acknowledge, first and foremost, what type of conservatives are we dealing with? For example, I'll be upfront, most of my family is on the more conservative end of things. They like this country and wish to preserve it through what means they understand to be effective. As such, they are different from someone who says, oh yes, I want this country to be exactly like the 1970s. Or someone who says, this country should go back to the gold standard, so on and so forth. They just want to preserve this country in their own way, usually using the 90s to 2010s as a reference. Others want to go even farther back, and that's a whole other thing. When it comes down to it, conservatives are varied and can be based on numerous things. Numerous times, numerous places, and sometimes they just straight up say good old days without explaining when, because, let's face it, there is never a perfect time in history. There's always something to complain about, because people are people. But what this means when it comes to conservatism is it can't win 100%. Sure, a certain brand of conservatism can win, but you can't have the neocons, for example, winning and the paleo-conservatives win as well. No, they have different beliefs on what they wish to conserve, what values they wish to protect. Similarly, you cannot have a Dixiecrat win when the northern conservatives are winning instead. Fundamentally different beliefs, fundamentally different pushes, and fundamentally different win conditions in terms of securing control and continued governance. But what should the conservatives do then? Well, naturally, this depends on specific circumstances, but there are a few general guidelines. 1. Accept modernization. This may seem weird, but you have to remember, a society of values cannot persist if it is weaker than those around it. Learning what works and what doesn't is just as important for a conservative society as any other. You do not want to end up like the Qing dynasty, carved up and divided by new powers because you let them modernize when you didn't. You must accept some level of modernization. For example, what sense does it make to be a complete Luddite and reject the conversion from paper to online management of bureaucracy, the paperless office? What benefit, honestly, is there in terms of efficiency in government management? There really isn't one. Sure, you might save some electricity costs, but the sheer amount of paper and other things used makes things vastly more inefficient. And so, while you may not want to change your cultural values, adapting some things, like, for example, modernizing office spaces and other things like military structure and such, is still important. You have to accept modernity. Think of plans to modernize and ensure that everything else is up to code while preserving that which you consider most valuable, say certain values, a religion, belief systems, etc. 2. Make common sense. This is particularly easy for conservatives because, well, what they're conserving is what's around them for the most part. It might have shifted a bit, but common sense is firmly in their corner because, well, this is the society they grew up in and they're explaining to people. They quite literally are the ones who know common sense because, well, that is the society around them. It is common. And so the understanding is easily from their perspective. Sure, there might be some pushback, counterculture maybe, but generally they are what is considered common sense, short of periods of great progression. And so making what is common sense clear and easy to understand helps people because, well, they understand your position and it just sounds normal. Like, if I were to say taxes suck to be taken from you, most people would say, oh yeah, that's freaking common sense. But really, it isn't inherently. Depending on belief systems, one can easily say, oh yeah, taxes are great. I have actually had teachers say this, as a matter of fact. And while I disagree, necessary evil and all, you can definitely see why that's important. Because if people can convince others that their beliefs are the baseline, are common sense, well then, that makes it a whole lot easier to persuade them on other things. Because if my beliefs are common sense, then who are you to argue against them? I assume the role of the proven, even if I'm not. And of course, another thing, behave morally. This is a thing for most ideologies, but for conservatives, it really needs to be nailed down. Same with socialists, but for different reasons. For the socialists, they want to behave morally so they can shine themselves as better. For the conservatives, it's to preserve what they have. If you remember the 90s or the 80s, basically back when televangelists were a big deal, one of the biggest things that made the evangelicals look really bad and basically disprove their movement was all the scandals they got up to of basically breaking their own morals. If you are preaching what is moral, what is right, what values should be held and not, it is fundamentally damaging to your movement to go against those morals. It's a neutral thing to follow them because that's expected. If I say cheating on your significant other is wrong, and then I don't cheat on my spouse, that's a neutral thing. That's kind of expected. But if I say cheating on your spouse is wrong and I'm off having 3 affairs, well then guess what? No one cares what I said because my actions prove that I do not follow it. And when my entire belief system is built around those ideas, well then things fall apart. For the conservative, in order to maintain any momentum, morality must be followed. Because if you're trying to say, we must conserve these values, these principles of behavior, of governance, etc., you must actively live them. Otherwise, you're showing yourself to not really be interested in conserving them, but rather in having your own power with others following and you not. A rules for thee and not for me situation does not work out well for conservatives. Especially if you're dealing with someone who has license to behave in a certain way. For example, there are belief systems which say, under duress or certain situations, you can do certain things. Pragmatism especially relies on this. But moral arguments, moralist beliefs, do not. If you were to tell someone who says, I believe that killing is wrong except in A, B, C, D, then you can have that person kill someone, so long as they meet one of those criteria, no one's going to bat an eye. But if someone just says, killing is wrong, flat out, don't do it ever, well then guess what? The moment you kill a single person, people are going to say, okay, he's not trustworthy, he clearly doesn't follow his own beliefs. And that is a very bad thing for that movement. Now, of course, that's an extreme example, but it makes the point clearly. Some beliefs rely on morality. Conservatism especially does, because it is tied firmly to their belief system. They do not make arguments of, well, for the sake of progress. They make arguments of, for the sake of preservation of values A, B, C. And if you don't live up to those values, you are essentially betraying your own beliefs. And that is very bad, needless to say. And of course, another thing is to control populism. This may seem like a weird thing to mention, but it's important to note, especially with Trump now in office. Populism is one of the biggest double-edged swords for any conservative movement. Or truthfully, any movement at all. Because the people, I'll say it bluntly, are freaking dumb. So many people have ideas of what is right, what is wrong, without understanding the basic principles of it. If you were to tell a person, I'm going to get rid of Medicare and Medicaid, they're going to say, oh, you're horrible, how do you do that? But if all evidence says these things make you, including the person that I'm taking it away from, not have good health care while costing easily 10 times as much, well then suddenly arguing for it is a bad idea, but arguing for its removal is a good one. But to the average person, do they know this? Does the average person understand economics in any legitimate way beyond what they hear on the news? Not really, no. They just hear, oh, we're in a recession now. Oh, prices are up. They don't actually understand what's going on behind the scenes. They just see results appearing as they go. And so, for the populist, something like, say, price controls sounds great. Don't raise prices too much. Set a price limit. But not knowing the economy, that's going to end very poorly. But they still vote for it or would support it because it sounds nice. The people are good at certain things. Managing their own lives, they can be fine at. Understanding how the country works, they cannot. So when you're dealing with populists, especially as conservatives, you need to control them, sway them. Because otherwise you end up with a bunch of people who don't know how to freaking operate a country leading. And I hate to break it to everyone, but populism tends to fall off a cliff eventually. And you better hope the establishment that comes after that is good at picking up pieces. I have no objection to a populist over someone who is worse at managing the economy in terms of establishment politics. But populism is not something I can legitimately support, and I don't think conservatives should either, because fundamentally, if you get the people hyped up but they don't know what they're doing, you've just got a mob. And a mob is not effective at governing anything. And for another thing, and this is just a general rule for all people, but especially for conservatives, read up on what you are complaining about. If you cannot explain gender theory or critical theory at all, then you should not be talking about it much. Not because it's not important or that you can't poke holes in it, but rather because fundamentally, if you can't argue against it honestly, you are going to have issues. If you, for example, believe firmly that transgender people are the gender they were born as, and that all genders only exist as two, which are connected to biological sex, you can argue that, yes, and you can make pretty decent arguments, in my opinion, for it, but it relies fundamentally on understanding both your position and theirs. If you argue from ignorance, that doesn't help you or make your case. You gotta truly understand the enemy to be able to prove the enemy wrong. In essence, when you're looking at something, you shouldn't just say, oh, these freaking idiots. You should ask, okay, what is it they believe and how is it idiotic? For example, maybe using a person who was mistreated by their own experimenter and forced to do sexual acts with their brother, only to later commit suicide after they said the gender they were forced to transition into was wrong, isn't the best when it comes to, justifying either transitioning or the idea that there are multiple genders. Well, more than two at least. Generally, that's a bad idea. Understand what you're arguing against first. Otherwise, you're just going to sound like an idiot, and a person who is actually educated, but still wrong, can run circles around you. If you had a person who only knows that the world is round, and suddenly they got into an argument with a flat earther who did their research, they're going to make it look like flat earth is correct, when it isn't. And that isn't a good thing. And as a general rule, just don't pick a fight when you're not going to win because you don't know much about it. Stand up for your beliefs, sure. If you want to make a moral argument, fine, you can make a moral argument. But just don't act like an idiot. Remember, if you're playing to win, you don't win by being an idiot. You don't win by just pulling a bunch of ignorant masses and saying, they say I'm right, so clearly I am. You win by going, alright, here's your beliefs. They're wrong here, here, and here. My beliefs are this. Here's why they're right here, here, and here. And when they rebuff you and say, no, actually that's wrong, you can make a counter-argument. Plan, react, and ensure that you can control what you understand and what they do. Because you understand them and you understand your own beliefs. Understand what you are arguing against and for, and you can ensure that you can win. This is something you really need to factor in. Beyond that, it really depends on situations. For example, I doubt the Japanese conservatives would have the same policies as American conservatives because fundamentally they are different. For example, Japanese conservatives may be more religious in other religions than Americans, but also they hold fundamentally different beliefs on society. As a result, the differences mean different proposals and different ways of handling things. So these are the 5 I can give as a general rule. Beyond that, it depends on circumstance. Have a good one, and thank you for watching.